This is an audio short story, No Matter What, by Jim Pope, read by Quack McMullard, Chapter 5.
No Matter What, Chapter 5. Today Paul would be starting to learn the art of flying a light plane. His first lesson would cover theory, navigation, and radio use, plus all the formalities that go along with doing a course like this. One thing he would not be doing today was actually flying. That would start during the second lesson. This was the first step along a road to learn so many things that sometimes overwhelmed him, but he felt confident that once he started, it would all fall into place. He had also signed up for a course on motorbike riding, but to do this course he needed to own a motorbike. So after the flying lesson, he headed to a motorcycle dealer. There was a bit of catch-22 here, as he needed a bike to do the course, but how could he buy a bike if he did not know how to ride it? He decided to purchase a 125 trail bike, as it would be easier to learn on and would be similar to the bike he would be using in the prison break. Paul had already spent time researching which bike to buy, so he didn't need all the sales banter from the salesman, so he cut him short and just said, "I want that one." He organised the dealer to deliver the bike directly to the bike riding school. Paul's schedule was a full one, with flying lessons on Mondays and Thursdays, with bike riding lessons on Tuesdays and Fridays. On Wednesdays he was learning to sail. He had joined a sailing club, and on Wednesdays they ran sailing lessons. These took the form of acting as crew on yachts while they were participating in races around the harbour. Paul's sailing lessons mostly involved winding a winch, but it was valuable experience. It did show him that even though he would gain experience from the sailing club lessons, he would need to do a lot of study himself to learn everything he would need to know. Like the flying lessons, Paul's first bike ride lesson did not include any actual bike riding. He had to do a written test and fill out forms in order to get his learner's permit. The rest of the lesson involved familiarising himself with the motorbike operations. The bike riding course was only 2 weeks long. After that he would gain experience while riding on the street. Once the bike riding course ended, the skydiving course would be starting, with a tandem skydive. Paul's second flying lesson did involve flying. Just some basic flying straight and level. Over the coming weeks he would learn much more, including the tricky bits of takeoff and landings. His second bike riding lesson went well. Bike riding came to him naturally, and he found the whole process a bit of fun. He would have no problem getting his bike licence, but he would have to use the bike a fair bit to be very good at it. The bike riding element of the prison break did not need him to ride fast and furious. In fact, he would need to blend in with the local population, so just staying on the bike would be enough. He would need to get some experience with having a pillion passenger, as Janet would be on the back of the bike during the escape. After the first week of training, Paul was feeling quietly confident, as he was finding everything fairly easy, and it was just a matter of time before he mastered the tasks ahead of him. He was still apprehensive at the prospect of jumping out of a plane, but he would give it a go. Paul got home from his second bike riding lesson at around 3:30 to find Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennett and Detective Constable George Blake at his front door. Paul drove into the driveway, got out of his car and walked towards them and said, "Hello, Lizzie and George. That was good timing. Another few minutes and I would have missed you. What can I do for you two today?" said Paul in a friendly manner. "We'd just like to ask you a few questions," replied Lizzie. Paul opened his front door. "Come on in, would you like a cup of tea? Have a seat," said Paul in a welcoming way. "Where were you on the night of Thursday the 10th?" asked Lizzie. "Well, let me think," said Paul, pretending he had to think about it. "Wasn't that our date night, or more like our non-date night?" said Paul. "Yes," replied Lizzie, "but where did you go after that?" "I'm a bit hurt you don't remember, Lizzie," said Paul, while winking at George. George smiled and looked away. Paul continued, "You were sitting in your car out the front till around 7 in the morning. You should have hung around so we could have had breakfast together." "What about the next nights?" asked Lizzie. Paul picked up a remote and pointed at the sound system. Barry Manilow started singing, "All by Myself." He pressed it again and said, "I was here all night and morning." "Come on, Lizzie, you don't really think I'm a burglar, do you?" "Can anyone confirm that?" asked Lizzie. "Colin was here, but he can't help," said Paul. Lizzie was a bit surprised and asked, "Can I speak to Colin?" "You can, but you won't get much out of him, except the odd meow," replied Paul, while pointing at Colin the cat, who was sleeping in his basket. Paul thought he saw a slight smile from Lizzie, whereas George had a broad grin until Lizzie looked at him with disapproval. Lizzie turned back to Paul and just looked at him and said, "Thanks for your cooperation, sir." She and George started to walk towards the front door. "Hey, Lizzie," said Paul, "what are you doing next Wednesday? Would you like to come sailing with me?" Lizzie turned and looked at him. More accurately, she glared at him. Now, Lizzie, come on, you know you want to," said Paul. Lizzie just turned and walked away, with George a few paces behind her. Just as they were about to get into their car, George said to Lizzie, "You have to give it to him, he doesn't give up easily." Paul organised a bunch of flowers to be delivered to Lizzie at her work, with a card that just read, "Come on, you know you want to." Paul basically had the weekend off, as his next burglary job were all but planned except for deciding which night. One of the houses was unoccupied, so presented no problems. The other two were. Both were occupied by men in the middle of divorces. Paul would have to keep a watch on these two in order to pick a night. One of them was getting a divorce because he got caught out having an affair, so with a bit of luck he might spend some nights away from the house with his mistress. The owner of the other house presented a bit more of a problem, as apparently he hardly ever went out. Paul decided to take it a bit easy and just take care of the necessities of life, housework, shopping and cleaning. He also had a pile of homework to do in relation to flying, motorbike riding and skydiving, so he had a lot of reading to do. After a relaxed sort of a weekend, Paul ventured out on another job. According to his information, the house would be empty, so it should be an easy job. But he knew complacency would lead to mistakes, so he went into it with the same preparation that he put into his other jobs. All was going well. He got through the front door without any problems, and the alarm presented no challenge. He found his way to the study but could not find the safe. Maybe there wasn't one. After a bit more searching, he found the safe in a bedroom. It was very modern, so he set the combination cracker running and had a bit more of a look around. On entering the main bedroom, he saw movement in the bed. The house was occupied. He backed quietly out of the room and went straight back to the second bedroom. The cracker had done its job, so he opened the safe only to find it empty. So he closed it and made his way out. When he went to reactivate the alarm, he saw that the silent alarm had activated. He tried to reactivate the alarm in the hope that by doing so, the second alarm would deactivate, but instead the main alarm went off. He quickly made his escape, but only as far as the end of the driveway, when he heard a car approaching. So he hid in the garden bed that followed the hedge line. A private security company pulled into the driveway and stopped near the front of the house. The place lit up like a Christmas tree as the owner opened the front door. The security guard and the owner went inside, and a few moments later the alarm stopped. As soon as the alarm stopped, all the lights went out, so Paul made a run for it. He was only just out of the driveway when all the lights came back on again. He made his way along the road, keeping to the shadows as best he could, when he heard a car approaching, so he ducked behind a parked car. As the car passed, he saw it was a police car. Once the police car was out of sight, Paul ran as fast as he could back to his car. He threw his backpack into the boot and put a colourful shirt on over the black shirt he was wearing and pulled the fake number plates off the car. He then got out of there. His heart was pumping and he had to resist the temptation to drive fast as he drove along the street leading to the main road. As he turned out of the side street onto the main road, a car came up behind him, and blue lights lit up the night, so he pulled over. He sat in the car waiting for the police officer, thinking to himself, "This is it. I'm done like a dinner." The officer walked to the driver's side of the car and said, "Driver's license, please." Paul handed him his license, which was in the name of Ronald Hughes, and said, "How's your night been so far, officer?" The officer replied with, "Is this your car, Ronald?" "Well, yes and no. It's a company car. Janet Investments," said Paul. "Are you aware one of your tail lights is out?" the officer asked Paul. "No, but I haven't checked them for a month or so. Sorry about that, Chief," said Paul. "Better have it fixed before driving at night again, Ronald," replied the officer. "I'll take it to an auto electrician as soon as I can," said Paul. The police officer handed Paul his license and said, "Good night." "Good night, officer," said Paul. Paul's heart felt like it was pounding out of his chest, like you see in a cartoon, but he managed to keep it together long enough to drive off. He headed back to the garage, changed his clothes, and rode his push bike home, getting there just as the sun was coming up. He was in the shower trying to wash away the stress and tension when he heard the doorbell ring. He put a towel around his waist and answered the door. On opening the door, Paul found Lizzie and George. Lizzie was looking a little bit stern, but George looked his usual affable self. "Good morning, Lizzie, George. You're a bit early for breakfast. I'm only just out of bed," said Paul, and then, "Come on in, make yourself at home. What can I do for you on this beautiful morning?" "Where have you been for the last few hours?" asked Lizzie in her very official voice. Now, Lizzie, George, if you want to drop in for breakfast, you don't need to go through the pretext of me being a burglar. You're welcome any time," said Paul in a teasing way. Lizzie responded gruffly with, "You didn't answer the question." "Oh, Lizzie, you make me sad," said Paul, and then, "Here, where else would I be, Lizzie? And before you ask..." Paul picked up the remote and pointed at the sound system, but Lizzie stood in front of it. "Not a fan of Barry Manilow, Lizzie." "That's a good sign," said Paul. George smiled, but Lizzie remained stern. Paul put the remote down and said, "Well, how about that breakfast?" "No thanks. Can we have a look around?" asked Lizzie. "Of course you can. Make yourself at home," said Paul. "I might have some breakfast. I'm starving." Paul started getting breakfast and then opened a tin of cat food and called Colin. Lizzie and George gave the house a brief look around and returned to the kitchen. Lizzie said to Paul, "Your bed looks like it hasn't been slept in." Paul replied with, "There's no law against being brought up well, Lizzie. I always make my bed as soon as I get up. I bet you do too." Colin rubbed up against Lizzie's leg and Paul said, "I think he likes you, Lizzie." "Thanks for your cooperation, sir," Lizzie said in a robotic way as she and George walked towards the front door. "Thanks for dropping in. Call again any time. Shut the door after you, as I don't want Colin to get out," Paul called out to them. Lizzie stopped in the doorway, turned and looked back at Paul. She looked conflicted. Paul smiled at her and said, "It's all right, Lizzie." Paul sat down on the lounge. Colin came over and sat on his lap and purred as if to reassure him that it was all right. Paul pondered on his close call, but it all worked out. Like any endeavour like this, there is bound to be a few close calls. Paul made his way to the garage and drove the Falcon to a car yard and traded it in on a Holden Commodore. He also destroyed the false ID of Ronald Hughes. The start of a new week, and a very busy week it would be. After Paul's bike lesson, he headed to the garage to prepare for a long night. As it was vital that the garage was not discovered, he had to travel there by a very convoluted route each time he went there. This added quite a bit of time to the trip, but it was necessary. Once at the garage, he went through the plan for the night over and over till it became instinct. In the early part of the night, he would hide outside one of the targets. Luckily, this area was a very leafy suburb, with lots of elaborate gardens, hedges and trees, so it was easy, if uncomfortable, to hide in the bushes once it got dark. If the owner of the house went out, Paul would burgle that house. But if he didn't, he would move on to the second target house, which was unoccupied. As luck would have it, the owner of the first house did go out, so Paul quickly made his way around the back of the house and had no trouble getting through the back door, and the alarm was very basic. It took him some time to feel his way around the house and locate the office. The safe turned out to be in the floor, under a fancy rug. It was a digital safe, but quite old, so the safe cracker made short work of coming up with the combination. When Paul opened it, he could hardly believe his eyes. It was packed with gold bars, so many that it would be hard to carry them back to the car. He filled his backpack and was about to close the safe when he noticed the headline on the newspaper on the desk. It read, "What a sorry state of affairs." So he tore the word sorry from the paper and put it in the safe. With the room now back the way it was, Paul left, making sure the alarm was reset and the back door was locked. The weight of the backpack made the walk back to the car a bit of a struggle, but he made it without being seen. It was just after 2 in the morning, but Paul did not want to go back to the garage at that time, as he might be heard, so he needed to kill some time. He decided to not burgle the second house, as going by the weight of the gold, he would not have to do any more jobs, so why press his luck? He could not just sit in the car, but driving around also had some risk as well, so he drove to the nearby nature reserve and tried to sleep, which he didn't. It felt like days, but at 5:30 in the morning he headed back to the garage, and as he would not get back there for some days, he just had to weigh the gold. It weighed in at 5 kilos, which made it worth just over $250,000. Paul headed home feeling on top of the world. He would not have to do any more burglaries, so with some luck he would get away with it, but he still needed to sell it, and with such a large amount, that may be a problem. He tried to get some sleep, as he had a flying lesson just after lunch. A great sense of relief came over him, as one of the elements that made up the Great Escape was now in place. Well, sort of. He also felt very relaxed, as there was a good chance that the burglary would not be discovered for a while, as there was nothing else in the safe, so the only reason to open the safe was to remove gold. There's a good chance that that doesn't happen very often, but when it is discovered, he is sure to get a visit from Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennett. After his flying lesson, Paul sent Lizzie a text message in the hope of persuading her to go sailing with him the next day. The text read, "Cove Sailing Club, 10 a.m, Wednesday. Outdoor clothes, runners. See you there. Come on, you know you want to." Paul had no expectations that Lizzie would show up to go sailing. If she did, he would have to explain that she would have to work, so he was pleasantly surprised when he saw her car pull up in the driveway. He could not really work out why she kept showing up for these invitations. He concluded that she was working, keeping an eye on him. But on the other hand, maybe she just liked the attention. "Well, Lizzie," Paul said as he walked over, "you decided to come." "It was my day off and I didn't have anything else and—" She paused and then, "I've never been sailing before." "Which one is yours?" replied Lizzie. "None of them," said Paul. "I'm learning to sail, and what better way to do it than to act as a crew." "What about me?" replied Lizzie. "Yes, you will be crew as well," said Paul, then continued, "But don't worry, it's not hard. You might have to turn a winch or two." Today's sailing was just a pleasant sail-come lesson, so it would be very relaxed. The yacht was motored away from its mooring before setting the sails. Paul was involved in this, but Lizzie just sat on the deck. Once into the open water, more sail was hoisted and the yacht really started to get along. It was sailing with the wind, and all Lizzie and Paul had to do was sit on the side of the yacht, acting as ballast. As they sat there, the spray misting across Lizzie, giving her a ghostly appearance, forming small droplets of water on her face, the wind gently blowing her hair. Paul just sat there, bewitched by her beauty. She turned her head and saw Paul looking at her. She leaned over and said, "I wish you weren't a burglar." Paul just smiled at her for a few moments, then leaned towards her and whispered to her, "How about a retired burglar?" Lizzie looked out towards the horizon for what seemed like minutes before saying, "Unfortunately, it wouldn't make any difference." They sat there for a bit longer before things got very busy, as the yacht needed to change course, and Paul had to help with dropping the sails, plus operating one of the winches. It was just on dusk as they got back to the sailing club. Paul invited Lizzie to dinner, but she declined. Of all the new skills Paul was learning, sailing was his favourite. It was peaceful and made him feel like everything would be fine. Flying, motorbike riding and skydiving were exciting and dangerous, so didn't make him feel secure, quite the opposite. They did make him feel alive, but there was no substitute for feeling safe. The next few days were taken up with more flying lessons as well as motorbike riding lessons. Paul now had the problem of what to do with the gold. He was concerned that it would look suspicious to try and sell such a large amount at once, or even over a few months. He decided to use some of his other false identities. He would then get a prospector's license in different names and sell the gold to different merchants in small amounts over a few months. This would mean a lot of work melting the gold down and making it look like gold nuggets. He would have to do some experimenting, maybe try a gas camping stove, or a cast iron fry pan, or a blowtorch like the plumbers use. Whatever he used, he would have to be careful not to draw attention to himself.
Copyright 2022. To listen to or read more chapters, go to www.yellowduckmotorsport.com. Click on Books, drop-down menu, then click on No Matter What. To listen to more chapters or to read, click on Chapters.